Picture this. A man stands atop a mountain, gazing out at a lush, fertile land stretching as far as the eye can see. This is the promised land, the culmination of a 40-year journey. But for the man looking out over this vista, it's a bittersweet moment, because he knows he will never set foot in this land. This man is Moses, one of the most significant figures in religious history, and this is the tragic irony of his fate. For decades, Moses led the Israelites through hardship and miracle alike. Born a slave in Egypt, raised as a prince, then exiled as a fugitive, Moses' life was extraordinary from the start. But it was his role as the deliverer of his people that truly set him apart. He confronted Pharaoh, brought down the 10 plagues, parted the Red Sea, and received the 10 commandments directly from God. Moses was not just a leader, he was a prophet, a lawgiver, and the very foundation of Judaism. His influence extends far beyond his own faith, touching Christianity and Islam as well. And yet, despite all he had done, despite his pivotal role in the Exodus and the formation of the Israelite nation, Moses died here on Mount Nebo, within sight of the Promised Land, but forbidden to enter it. In the next 24 minutes, we'll explore the fascinating and complex reasons behind this puzzling decree. Why did God, after all Moses had done, deny him entry into Canaan? What led to this divine decision, and what can we learn from it? Join us as we retrace the steps of Moses and the Israelites, examining the incidents that shaped their journey, the moments of triumph and transgression, and the ultimate lesson in leadership, faith, and the sometimes mysterious nature of divine justice. To understand why Moses didn't enter the Promised Land, we need to go back to the beginning of his extraordinary journey. Our story starts in ancient Egypt, around 1391 BCE. The Pharaoh, fearing the growing Israelite population, had ordered all newborn Hebrew boys to be thrown into the Nile. But one mother couldn't bear to do it. Instead, she placed her infant son in a basket and set him adrift on the river. In a twist of fate, the baby was discovered by none other than Pharaoh's daughter. She named him Moses, meaning drawn out of the water, and raised him as her own in the royal palace. For 40 years, Moses lived as an Egyptian prince, enjoying all the luxuries of the royal court. But he never forgot his Hebrew heritage. One day, witnessing an Egyptian overseer beating a Hebrew slave, Moses intervened, killing the Egyptian. Fearing for his life, Moses fled Egypt, finding refuge in Midian. There, he lived as a shepherd for another 40 years, married and started a family. It seemed his days of grandeur were behind him. But God had other plans. At the age of 80, Moses encountered a burning bush that wasn't consumed by the flames. From this bush, God spoke, commanding Moses to return to Egypt and lead the Israelites to freedom. Please kindly subscribe, share, and comment for more Bible stories. Reluctantly, Moses obeyed. He confronted Pharaoh, demanding the release of the Israelites. When Pharaoh refused, God sent 10 plagues upon Egypt, each more devastating than the last. Finally, after the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn, Pharaoh relented. The Exodus began, with over 600,000 Israelites following Moses out of Egypt. But Pharaoh changed his mind, pursuing the Israelites to the Red Sea. There, in one of the most famous miracles in religious history, God parted the waters, allowing the Israelites to cross on dry land. When the Egyptians followed, the sea crashed back down, destroying Pharaoh's army. The Israelites were free, but their journey was far from over. What should have been a relatively short trip to the Promised Land turned into 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. These years were filled with hardships, thirst, hunger, and constant complaining from the people. Moses faced challenge after challenge, mediating between an often rebellious people and an exacting God. It was during this time that Moses received the 10 Commandments on Mount Sinai, establishing the covenant between God and the Israelites. He became not just their leader, but their lawgiver and prophet. As the 40 years drew to a close, a new generation of Israelites had grown up in the wilderness. They stood poised to enter the Promised Land. But for Moses, now 120 years old, a different fate awaited. After nearly 40 years of wandering, the Israelites found themselves in the desert of Zin, camped near a place called Kadesh. It was here, on the very brink of entering the Promised Land, that a pivotal event occurred, one that would seal Moses' fate. The journey had been long and arduous. The people were tired, thirsty, and their patience was wearing thin. Despite all the miracles they had witnessed, the plagues in Egypt, the parting of the Red Sea, manna from heaven, their faith was once again being tested. The problem? There was no water. And as it had happened so many times before, the people's response was to complain bitterly to Moses and Aaron. "Israelite, why have you brought us to this terrible place? There's no grain, no figs, no vines, no pomegranates, and there's not even any water to drink." Israelite 2, if only we had died when our brothers fell dead before the Lord. Why did you bring us out of Egypt to this terrible place? Faced with yet another rebellion, Moses and Aaron did what they had done so many times before. They fell face down before the Lord, seeking his guidance. God spoke to Moses, giving him clear instructions on how to provide water for the people. God's voice, deep and resonant, "Take the staff, and you and your brother Aaron gather the assembly together. Speak to that rock before their eyes, and it will pour out its water." The instructions were simple. Speak to the rock, and water would flow. It was to be a demonstration of God's power and provision, a moment of divine intervention that would reinforce the people's faith. But something was different this time. Perhaps it was the weight of 40 years of leadership. Perhaps it was frustration with the constant complaining. Whatever the reason, Moses was angry. "Moses, listen, you rebels, must we bring you water out of this rock?" And then, instead of speaking to the rock as God had commanded, Moses struck the rock twice with his staff. Water gushed out. The people's thirst was quenched. The immediate crisis was averted. But in that moment of anger and disobedience, everything changed. God's voice came to Moses and Aaron, this time with a devastating judgment. God's voice, "Because you did not trust in me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land I give them." In that instant, Moses' dream of leading his people into the promised land was shattered. After all he had been through, after all he had done, this single act of disobedience would prevent him from completing his life's mission. The water continued to flow, but for Moses, something far more precious had slipped away. The promised land, so close he could almost touch it, would forever remain just out of reach. God's decision to prevent Moses from entering the promised land may seem harsh at first glance. After all, hadn't Moses dedicated his life to leading the Israelites? To understand this judgment, we need to delve deeper into its significance and the lessons it teaches us. 1. The significance of disobedience. First, let's consider the gravity of Moses' disobedience. It might appear to be a small thing, striking a rock instead of speaking to it. But in God's eyes, it represented a serious breach of trust and obedience. God's instructions were clear. By striking the rock, Moses not only disobeyed a direct command, but also misrepresented God's character to the people. Instead of demonstrating God's mercy and simply speaking to the rock, Moses' actions portrayed God as angry and punitive. This wasn't just any disobedience. It came from the one person who had spoken with God face to face, who had performed miraculous signs, who had received the 10 Commandments. The higher the position, the greater the responsibility. 2. Moses as a leader and role model. This brings us to our second point, Moses' role as a leader and role model. Leadership expert. Leaders are held to a higher standard because their actions set the tone for everyone else. Moses wasn't just any Israelite, he was the Israelite. His actions didn't just affect him, they influenced the entire nation. If Moses could disobey God and seemingly get away with it, what message would that send to the people? God's punishment of Moses served as a powerful object lesson to the Israelites about the importance of obedience, regardless of one's status. 3. The importance of faith and trust in God. At its core, Moses' action demonstrated a lack of faith and trust in God. By striking the rock, Moses took matters into his own hands, instead of trusting God's method. This mirrors the broader struggle of the Israelites throughout their journey, trusting in what they could see and control, rather than in God's promises. God's harsh judgment on Moses underscored the critical importance of maintaining faith and trust, even in the face of frustration and adversity. It was a lesson not just for Moses, but for all the Israelites, and indeed for all who would read this story in the future. Before, symbolic meaning. The old generation passing away. Finally, we must consider the symbolic meaning of Moses not entering the Promised Land. Moses represented the generation that left Egypt, a generation marked by slavery, doubt, and repeated lack of faith. Despite his personal greatness, Moses was part of that generation that God had decreed would not enter the Promised Land. Joshua, who would lead the people into Canaan, represented a new generation, one born in freedom, shaped by the wilderness experience, and ready to claim God's promises by faith. In this light, Moses' death before entering the Promised Land symbolizes the complete break with the old life in Egypt. It marks the end of the Exodus and wandering period, and the beginning of a new chapter in Israel's history. So we see that God's decision, while difficult, carried deep significance. It emphasized the importance of obedience, the high standards of leadership, the crucial nature of faith and trust, and the symbolic transition to a new era for the Israelites. As the Israelites stood on the threshold of the Promised Land, Moses knew his time was drawing to a close. Despite the disappointment of not being able to enter Canaan himself, Moses focused on preparing his people for the challenges that lay ahead. 1. Preparations for entering Canaan. Moses spent his final days ensuring the Israelites were ready for their new life in Canaan. He reviewed the laws God had given them, reminded them of their covenant with God, and warned them about the temptations they would face in their new home. He also took care to document their journey and God's instructions, creating a record that would guide future generations. This collection of writings would later become the first 5 books of the Bible, known as the Torah or Pentateuch. 2. Appointing Joshua as his successor. One of Moses' most crucial tasks was to ensure a smooth transition of leadership. God had chosen Joshua, Moses' faithful assistant, to lead the people into the Promised Land. Please kindly subscribe, share, and comment for more Bible stories. Moses, speaking to Joshua, "Be strong and courageous, for you must go with this people into the land that the Lord swore to their ancestors to give them, and you must divide it among them as their inheritance. The Lord himself goes before you and will be with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged." With these words, Moses publicly commissioned Joshua, passing the mantle of leadership to the next generation. 3. Final speeches and blessings to the Israelites. In his final days, Moses addressed the entire assembly of Israel. These speeches, recorded in the book of Deuteronomy, serve as Moses' farewell address to his people. Moses said, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength." Moses recounted their journey, reminded them of God's laws, and urged them to remain faithful to their covenant with God. Moses said, "See, I set before you today life and prosperity, death and destruction. For I command you today to love the Lord your God, to walk in obedience to him, and to keep his commands, decrees, and laws. Then you will live and increase, and the Lord your God will bless you in the land you are entering to possess." Moses then pronounced blessings on each of the 12 tribes of Israel, prophesying about their future roles in the nation. These were Moses' last acts of leadership, preparing his people, establishing his successor, and blessing the nation he had led for so long. Though he wouldn't enter the Promised Land with them, his influence would continue to guide the Israelites long after his passing. As Moses concluded his final address, he knew his extraordinary journey was coming to an end. But even in these last moments, his thoughts were not of himself, but of the people he had led and the God he had served. The time had come. After 120 years of life, 40 years of leading the Israelites through the wilderness, Moses' journey on earth was about to end. 1. Climbing Mount Nebo. God instructed Moses to climb Mount Nebo in the land of Moab. This would be Moses' final ascent, his last act of obedience to the God he had served so faithfully. As he climbed, did Moses reflect on his extraordinary life? The burning bush, the plagues of Egypt, the parting of the Red Sea, the giving of the law on Mount Sinai, each step might have brought back a flood of memories. 2. Viewing the Promised Land. At the top of Mount Nebo, Moses stood alone. Before him stretched the land that God had promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob centuries before. And there, God granted Moses a supernatural vision of the Promised Land. God's voice. This is the land I promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob when I said, I will give it to your descendants. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you will not cross over into it. From this vantage point, Moses could see the whole land, from Gilead to Dan, all of Naphtali, the territory of Ephraim and Manasseh, all the land of Judah as far as the Mediterranean Sea, the Negev, and the whole region from the valley of Jericho, the city of palms, as far as Zoar. It was a bittersweet moment. Moses could see the fulfillment of God's promise, the culmination of the journey he had led for so long. Yet he knew he would not set foot in this land. 3 Moses' death and burial. There on Mount Nebo, Moses, the servant of the Lord, died as the Lord had said. The Bible tells us that Moses was 120 years old when he died, yet his eyes were not weak, nor his strength gone. His work was done, his journey complete. The manner of Moses' burial is shrouded in mystery. The book of Deuteronomy simply states, he buried him in Moab, in the valley opposite Beth Peor, but to this day no one knows where his grave is. Some traditions suggest that God himself buried Moses, a final act of intimacy between the Lord and his servant. The exact location of his grave remains unknown, perhaps to prevent it from becoming a place of idolatrous worship. The Israelites mourned for Moses in the plains of Moab for 30 days, until the time of weeping and mourning was over. And so ended the life of Moses, prophet, leader, lawgiver. He died on the very threshold of the Promised Land, his life's mission complete, having guided his people to the edge of their new home. Though Moses died without entering the Promised Land, his legacy has endured for millennia, shaping not just Judaism, but influencing Christianity, Islam, and beyond. Moses' enduring influence on Judaism and other religions. In Judaism, Moses is revered as the greatest prophet who ever lived, the one through whom God gave the Torah. His laws and teachings form the foundation of Jewish life and practice to this day. In Christianity, Moses is seen as a precursor to Jesus, his law setting the stage for Christ's teachings. Islam regards Moses as a crucial prophet, with his story told extensively in the Quran. Even in secular contexts, the principles of justice and morality found in Mosaic law continue to influence legal and ethical thinking worldwide. Number 2, lessons for leadership and obedience. Moses' life offers timeless lessons in leadership. His journey teaches us about the importance of humility, perseverance in the face of adversity, and the courage to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult. Yet, Moses' fate also serves as a stark reminder of the weight of leadership. His moment of disobedience cost him dearly, teaching us that leaders are held to a higher standard and that consistent obedience matters. Number 3, the balance of justice and mercy in God's dealings. Perhaps one of the most profound lessons from Moses' story is the delicate balance between justice and mercy in God's dealings with humanity. On one hand, we see God's justice in not allowing Moses to enter the Promised Land due to his disobedience. On the other, we see God's mercy in allowing Moses to view the land and in the honored manner of his death. This balance reminds us that while our actions have consequences, God's love and mercy remain constant. Even in disappointment, Moses experienced God's grace. In the end, Moses' life and death teach us about faith, leadership, obedience, and the complex relationship between humanity and the divine. His story continues to resonate, challenging us to consider our own journeys, our own promises, and our own relationship with God. We've journeyed through the extraordinary life of Moses, from his miraculous survival as an infant to his final moments on Mount Nebo. 1. Recap of main points. We've seen Moses lead the Israelites out of Egypt, receive the 10 Commandments, and guide his people through 40 years in the wilderness. We've also witnessed his crucial moment of disobedience at Kadesh, striking the rock instead of speaking to it as God commanded. This act of disobedience, seemingly small but deeply significant, led to God's decree that Moses would not enter the Promised Land. Yet, in his mercy, God allowed Moses to view the land before his death. 2. Reflection on the complex nature of Moses' story. Moses' story is far from simple. It's a tale of faith and doubt, obedience and rebellion, divine justice and mercy. It shows us a leader who was great but flawed, a prophet who spoke to God face to face, yet still struggled with trust and obedience. In Moses, we see the tension between the public role of a leader and the personal journey of faith. We see a man who led a nation to freedom, but couldn't overcome his own limitations to enter the promised land. 3. Invitation for viewers to consider the lessons in their own lives. Transition to scenes of modern life, people at work, in places of worship, facing challenges. As we conclude our exploration of why Moses died before reaching the promised land, we're left with profound questions to consider in our own lives. How do we balance leadership with personal faith? How do we handle the weight of responsibility? How do we respond when our deepest hopes and dreams seem to be denied? Perhaps you're in a leadership position, feeling the weight of responsibility. Or maybe you're facing your own wilderness, your own promised land, just out of reach. Moses' story reminds us that even the greatest among us face struggles and disappointments. But it also teaches us that our legacy isn't defined by a single moment of failure, nor by whether we personally see the fulfillment of every promise. Rather, it's shaped by a lifetime of choices, by our perseverance in the face of adversity, and by our willingness to play our part in a story much larger than ourselves. Please kindly subscribe, share, and comment for more Bible stories.